Hi, I'm Gavin, and welcome back to the S.O.U.N.D Project. On today's episode, we're starting a new series where we're just talking about different acoustical terminology and metrics, and today's topic is sound transmission class. With sound transmission class, it's something that we talk about with our clients all the time, and it's an industry metric where it basically describes how well sound is blocked by a partition. And the one thing about STC is that it's good for getting a general sense of how much sound a partition or a material is going to block. However, it can be misleading as well, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. The industry has adopted STC as a standard, and it's something that's talked about with architects and contractors and builders all the time, but there are some pitfalls of only relying on STC. But with STC, when you look at some ranges, the higher the number, the more sound is typically blocked. And STC is not frequency dependent, so it's not something where if you have an STC of 60 that it's just going to block 60 decibels across all the frequency spectrum. So it is, like I said, a little bit misleading. But we're going to clear some of that up today. If we look at this chart here and some of the different ranges of STC levels, we have from 25 to 30, that would be speech could be easily heard and understood through the wall. Just for an example, many of us have lived in apartment complexes before, and you have an apartment wall that is typically just a half-inch drywall on either sides of studs that may or may not have insulation in them. And those STC values typically range like in the low 30s. And so we have all experienced that where you can hear people's voices on the other side of the wall. And so 25 to 30 is fairly low for an STC rating. Then we move up a little bit, 35 to 45. That would be loud speech is audible, but it's less intelligible. So you can still tell that something's coming through the wall, but you may not be able to understand exactly what words are being said. From 50 to 55, that's where speech privacy is you're starting to achieve that. But loud sounds are still audible, so you may not be able to hear speech or understand speech through the wall, but if there was, let's say, a band playing or there's a guitar amp or something like that, you're going to be able to hear that with 50 to 55. For 60 to 65, you've got loud sounds are barely audible, and usually that 60 threshold is where, in many of our studio designs, that's where we start, is 60 and higher, and it all depends on what the client is needing, but 60 is kind of the start of where we're designing our studio STC values to be. And then 65 plus, you have very high sound isolation. Most sounds are inaudible. Doesn't mean that you won't hear anything on the other side of a wall that's 65 or higher, but it's going to be very much diminished and going to be a good start for trying to get isolation in a room. But it all depends on the room's application and also where it's located in relation to other rooms that could be sound sensitive. And also it's very subjective. Like every single person has a little bit different idea of how much sound isolation is enough for them. So how is STC measured? Basically, there's some different standards here. ASTM E90 is the standard for measuring TL values. And basically, in a laboratory, you measure the SPL across the room at various frequencies from 125 hertz up to 4,000 hertz. And you do that on each side of a wall that is built in a laboratory. So there's a source room and a receiving room, and then their partition is built in between. Now, one thing to notice is that in these laboratory conditions, a lot of times a contractor is taking a week to build one wall. And that's obviously not the same as what happens in the real world. So laboratory measurements typically exceed what ends up happening in the field because that type of care and time is not taken to build it once it's in the field. But in the laboratory, they do take that time to be able to try to get the best results possible. So you have the source room, you take measurements in there, you have the receiving room, you take measurements in there, and then that gives you your transmission loss values, like how many decibels is blocked across that partition. What you do is then you plot these transmission loss values onto a chart like the one that's shown on the bottom right side of the screen right now. And you have different standardized STC curves. So the dotted blue line on this chart is an STC curve. And what you have to do is try to get the best fit for the values that you got in the laboratory to various STC curves. And whichever one matches it the best while also not having having the correct number of deficiencies in each 1/3 octave band. So the maximum deficiencies that you can have, and deficiencies are just described as, if you look on the right-hand side of this graph here, you've got in the 2,000 to 4,000 hertz range, you see the red line dips below the dotted blue line. And for each one of those, for every decibel that you are below that curve, that's a deficiency. And so you have a maximum number of 32 deficiencies that you can have, and that's across the entire frequency spectrum, but you can only have up to 8 in a single 1/3 octave band. And so if a partition is really poor at a certain frequency, then that's going to reduce its STC value. So once you get that curve matched as best you can, and you've met the deficiencies that are the maximum number of deficiencies you can have, then wherever that line crosses at 500 hertz, you move over to the left-hand side of the graph, and that gives you your STC value. So what's being shown here on this graph is actually an STC of 56. And so this is something that the laboratory is typically going to do if they're testing it in the field, in the laboratory. But in the field, there's a whole different type of measurement technique, and something where typically those field measurements are going to be 3 to 5 points lower on average than what you get in a laboratory because of that care that was taken to build that wall. So we'll go through a few examples of STC levels for various materials. Starting on this chart, you have a hollow core wood door that's not sealed. That's an STC rating of 12, which is very, very low, and because it is a hollow door, and if it's not sealed, you probably have heard me talk about the importance of making an airtight room or a waterproof room to make sure that isolation is as good as possible. Because it doesn't take much when it comes to that leak in the system for it to drastically reduce the STC level. So an STC of 12, most sounds are going to be heard on the other side of that door, and that's very, very low. Moving on up, the next one here is 1 pound per square foot mass-loaded vinyl material, has an STC rating of 27. And one thing that's important to know is that STCs are not additive. So if you put 2 layers of mass-loaded vinyl that each have an STC of 27, if you put 2 layers in the system, that doesn't magically get you 54. It's a logarithmic addition that happens. You're probably going to be closer to the 30 to 33 range with 2 layers in there. And so it's important to know that, because otherwise it would be very easy to get very, very high STC levels in a wall because you could just add these values, but it's a logarithmic addition. So mass-loaded vinyls at 27. One thing to note is half-inch drywall, half-inch gypsum wallboard is a 28. And that's where STC can be very misleading, because mass-loaded vinyl is much better at blocking lower frequencies than half-inch drywall is, but half-inch drywall gets a rating of 1 better when it comes to the STC rating. Typical apartment wall, like I mentioned before, 2x4 studs with 1 layer of drywall on each side gets you an STC rating of 33. And then you look at 8 inches of poured concrete, gets you an STC of 58. And if you remember, I mentioned that we're typically shooting in our studios to get STC levels of 60 or higher, and so 8 inches of poured concrete doesn't even get you there. And so that's why some of these systems can be very complex, and we're adding a lot of mass. The walls get very, very thick. In some of the studios we design, the walls end up being 15, 18, 24 inches thick in order to get the isolation that the client requires. So now we're going to talk about how STC is misleading. And the thing is that it just oversimplifies how the material is blocking sound, because it's reducing it to a single value. And it's the industry's way of trying to boil down a very complex topic into a single number rating. And so there's going to be discrepancies there. And so it ignores low frequencies, anything below 125 hertz, because that's not part of the metric when you're calculating STC. And typically with sound isolation, the low frequencies is what we're most concerned about. It's typically like how you pull up next to a car that has a nice sound system. If all the windows are rolled up, all you're hearing is that low frequency energy radiating out of the car. As soon as they crack their window, you can hear vocals and cymbals and things like that. But those are very easy to block in comparison to the low frequencies, because the low frequencies are very powerful and long wavelengths. And so that's why one of the main main reasons that STC is misleading is because it doesn't consider anything below 125 hertz. It also doesn't account for impact noise. That's a whole nother rating called IIC, which we'll cover on this channel as well. But impact noise is something like someone walking above you with hard-soled shoes, or someone moving a piece of furniture above you, and you hear that impact sound coming through into your room. STC doesn't account for that. That's a whole separate metric that we're looking for. It also doesn't account for flanking paths. In a laboratory, this is built within a extremely solid, a lot of times like concrete rooms that this opening is in, and there's not a lot of flanking paths for sound to get around, and they use a sealant around the entire wall in order to make sure that sound's not leaking around the perimeter. Well, also in the real world, there's all sorts of flanking paths that sound could take. There's also, I mentioned, the field STC measurement. It's often 3 to 5 points lower. That's tested with an ASTM E336. We do this test a lot of times in the field when we're trying to diagnose sound isolation issues, and that's going to be different than what's done in a lab because of the care that's taken. And it's kind of limited with the usefulness in complex acoustical projects, because most of the time what we're doing is getting that transmission loss data that is frequency dependent and trying to take a look at that and see which materials are going to be best at stopping low frequencies or any frequencies that a particular project is struggling with. Looking at this graph that's on the right side of the screen right now shows how misleading STC values can be, because there's two different lines on here. There's a dark blue line and a black line. The dark blue line is a 4-inch solid concrete wall, and then the black line is a steel studded wall that has various layers of material on either side. And the thing is that the solid concrete wall has an STC of 47, and the steel stud wall has an STC of 48. But when you look at this, these walls couldn't be more different when it comes to its performance. The concrete wall is blocking 20 to 30 dB more in the low frequency range compared to the steel studded wall, and it's also doing the same thing, probably 15 to 20 dB better in the higher frequency range. The steel stud wall is performing better in the mid range, and that's most likely why it's going to get a higher rating of 48 over 47. But if all you were looking at was STC in a situation and trying to select which walls you would go with, you'd pick the steel stud wall all day because it has 1 point higher than the concrete wall. But if you dig deeper and look at the transmission loss values, you can clearly see that the concrete wall blocks way more energy in the low frequency range, and if that's what you're trying to target, it would be a better choice in this situation. So this is just a visual representation of how STC can be misleading, and you don't want to make your decisions based solely on that metric. So at Haversack Designs, we have this conversation all the time with clients where we're trying to figure out how much isolation is enough for them. And years ago, we created this sound isolation simulator on our website that allows people to hear the difference different STC values and transmission loss values are going to offer. And so essentially, on the website, it's under acoustical tools at the top menu bar, and you click on sound isolation simulator, and you want to listen to these samples on a nice set of speakers, something that can produce low frequencies well. For instance, a laptop demo is just not going to do it justice, and you want something that can create bass. And so once you have them set up to your speakers, you turn up the no partition sample, and you click play and turn that up as loud as it'll safely go. Like you want to simulate as if you're in the room with a live band, so it should be well above 100 decibels. And you get that to a point where it feels like you're in the room with the band. It's very harsh and loud, and you leave your volume set the same. And then as you scroll down on the website, there's a bunch of different wall types. There's probably 10 to 12 different wall types you can choose from, and it shows how it is built, the thickness of the wall, and some different metrics there. And next to each one of those wall types is a play button that you can click play and hear what it would sound like relatively on the other side of that wall. As long as you didn't adjust your volume from the initial case, you're going to hear the relative difference there based on the transmission loss values. And this can just be a really useful tool for you to be able to figure out how much sound blockage is acceptable for you, because it is a very subjective thing. One person might think that a certain amount of sound traveling through the wall is unacceptable, and then another person would be okay with it. And so we usually start with the clients, having them go through this exercise and tell us which wall type does it start to sound okay for them. Okay, and it gets increased, the STC values increase as you go down this website. And once they tell us, like, hey, wall G sounded pretty good to me, doesn't mean that we're going to design things exactly like that wall, but I do have the data for that wall, and I know that is meeting their requirements. And so the very useful tool to be able to just see what's all involved. It also helps set expectations, because you can start to see, as you scroll down on the website, the walls get more complex and sometimes more detailed, more materials are involved, and it kind of gives you an idea of what you're in for if you're trying to really isolate a room. So in summary, STC, it's a useful metric to get a really general sense of how well a material is at blocking sound, but it shouldn't be solely what you look at. You want to dig deeper into that and look at transmission loss values and make sure the partition is doing what you'd want it to. The laboratory measurement is going to exceed and be higher than the field metric typically, just due to the fact that there's more time taken building that wall, and there's no flanking paths and other things that are going on that could reduce that value like a field measurement would. STC is not simply additive, it's a logarithmic addition, and so it's something where it takes many layers, and something that it's not just adding a couple layers to your system is suddenly going to get you in the 70s. It takes a much more structured and a scientific approach, and it's limited in its usefulness. You kind of have to know what STC is good for, and you can use it for that, but don't count on it for giving you all the information you need to design a good wall partition. Well, that's been another episode of the S.O.U.N.D Project. Thanks for being a part of it. If you have any questions about STC that I didn't answer in this episode, please comment that below, and we'll see you next week.